Grateful to have you with us once again for an episode of the More People podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Fitzmaurice, joined in this episode by Sam Gibson of SGM. Thanks for joining us, Sam.
Thanks for having me.
We met a long time ago, and your role in your career has evolved and changed from that time to now. But catch us up on how you got into this world of finance and planning and pensions and investments.
Yeah, I didn't really get into it. I fell into it in that when I was at university in the 90s, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I chose quite a general degree subject, history, and only because I was good at history at school and I quite liked it, but I didn't know what I was going to do at the end of it. And then somebody said, "Do you want to be an accountant?" A friend of my dad's. And this was getting towards the end of my finals, and I didn't know what I wanted to do. So I lied and I said, yes, I'd love to be an accountant, which in some ways was a mistake. But in some ways it was very useful. So I trained as an accountant when I left university, and ultimately I was a failed accountant. It was good. It professionalized me and it made me grow up. So I moved into financial services in 2000, and I was an employed independent financial advisor for many of those years. And then I set SGM up along with a couple of colleagues, Tom and Lisa, 3.5 years ago. Independent chartered financial advisors, and we haven't looked back.
So does ploughing your own furrow now with your own business, does that give you more freedom, more choice, more independence? How is it different to working for another business?
It gives a lot more freedom in that it's down to us. We make all the decisions. There's no external party telling us if you can or can't do something. The three of us get on very well. That's crucial. I think if anyone's going to go into business with anybody else, it's a marriage, isn't it, of some form. And it's very, very important that you get on and that you're in harmony.
For people who perhaps aren't on that on that rung of the ladder yet to think about their financial planning, or they're not treating it as seriously as perhaps they should. And we all know that starting earlier is significantly preferable than starting late.
Yeah.
But broad brush, what do SGM do? How does it work?
Just going back a sec, it does work if you start early. So we get very few young clients, but it's great when we do because they can afford to take risk. But of course, when you're in your 20s and 30s, increasingly, you don't have much money, do you, nowadays? There's so many demands for your funds. So our typical client would be somebody who's already got some money and they don't know what to do with it.
Right.
Sometimes later in life, sometimes a little bit younger. And we advise what to do with the money.
So you don't just buy a few ounces of gold and put them under a mattress and wait for the price to go up. I'm assuming you did that.
No, we don't do that.
What happens next then when you have a conversation with someone about their plans, their time horizons, their tolerance to risk? Then what do you do with it?
We're regulated by the FCA, so we can only use investments that are FCA regulated, which is good. That means we can't do things like forex scams, cryptocurrency, all these crazy things that young kids are getting into. If you invest through a company like ours, it's FCA regulated. They're quite traditional investments in many ways: stocks and shares, commercial property, government bonds. And because we're independent, we use the companies that we think are the best at managing the money. And the word "the best," that's quite a glib, throwaway, meaningless expression, isn't it? Or can't it be? To us, the best means they will hopefully be the best performers and at the best price. It's very important if you're getting capital returns that they're not being eroded through charges.
The vast majority of things that are invested into groups of funds and groups of bonds to hedge the risk, as opposed to very singular sole companies.
They are through us. We're not stockbrokers. If you want to do something a bit more bespoke, where you probably want a bit of involvement yourself, then you would perhaps go down the route of stocks and shares, picking individual companies. And there's plenty of people who are very successful at that. But that's not our world. That's probably a risk level above what we're into. And you need serious amounts of money to be able to get a decent spread if you're picking your own thing on the markets. So we use funds. And generally speaking, with these funds, you'll get the same outcome if you put £1,000 in or 2 million in terms of the growth. They're very transparent. The percentage charges are pretty much the same.
And how much of it, when you're choosing a fund, how much of it is looking at the data sheet and the performance, or thinking about the statistical performance, or having a hunch, or just deliberately choosing South America and Asia, or oil and gas and telecoms? How do you go about making the decisions which ones are appropriate?
We kind of subcontract that out. The companies that we choose to do the investments for us, they are the geeks. They're the geniuses who analyse which sectors to be in, which geographical areas, which asset classes. They've got teams of analysts poring over it. They decide, and they seem to get it right. But our job is choosing which of those geniuses, which company of geniuses we use. And there's plenty of hard data that you can find out there, performance statistics, charges, but there is an intangible element to it as well. I've walked through your office just now and there's a buzz, isn't there? You can almost feel a sense of almost electricity in the air as you walk through. You've got young people on the phone. They all seem to be working very hard. Maybe it's just because you and Guy walk past them, but they do. And we want to use companies that are the same, that there's upward trend.
So what advice would you give, thinking about the population in our office, which is typically, like lots of recruitment companies, it's a younger demographic.
Yeah.
And I've said this on a previous podcast, but we feel an obligation to educate the team that we've got, because recruitment does come with the potential to earn good money at an age where either the demand is very high on the money that you have,
Yeah.
or the long-term thinking about pensions and investments and being 60 plus is so far away they don't care. So it's not necessarily in their consciousness. It's not on their radar to be doing these things.
Was it on yours when you were in your early mid-20s?
It was probably
was.
It was in the sense of there was a guilt about it, knowing you should do something about it. Did that then manifest as actually doing anything about it? Not sure. So I guess that the question, the challenge, and again the obligation as a caring employer is to get them to do something about it and present it in a way that it resonates.
Yep.
So they act for their long-term future, their long-term security. But if you have a big event in your life, or you're approaching retirement and you're doing planning, it's obvious to pick up the phone and talk to you. If you've come into some money, you pick up the phone and talk to you. If you're starting out, it's not so forefront of mind that you know where to start. And as a consequence, I think, and myself in my early 20s, you just put it off until you realise that you've hit 30, and then you think, oh, I've just squandered the first 10 years of work. Why didn't I do something about it? So what advice do you have? How do you try and bring it to the forefront of people's minds to do something about it and act?
It's difficult because we're not in their faces, are we? It's interesting the way you talk there, because you're talking as an employer trying to help your staff. That would never have happened 30, 40 years ago. Companies didn't think they have got a responsibility to these bright young things to try and, educate them with financial matters and other matters. It used to come from parents, didn't it? It's very, very hard to get in front of them. Social media it can be quite misleading with financial products. And do they want to sit down with somebody like me who can be quite dour, telling them things they probably don't want to hear? But I really relish it when we can get in front of young people and tell them what's out there, and just to show them it's not impossible. And with quite a small start, you can get there, can't you? You've seen it, I've seen it. When you're very young, you get the statements through and it doesn't seem to be going anywhere, but suddenly it builds. You get a bit of momentum with anything you're doing, whether it's taking exams or some challenge in life. You just need to get a little bit under your belt, and then you almost get growth on growth.
I wonder whether
it's just getting in front of the people.
Yeah, and certainly when the algorithms and the browsing history just serves up more of what they like,
and
this doesn't then come into their eye line, does it?
The problem is it comes up on my social media as well, because I look at these dodgy crooks, so no offense, but they are, in fake private jets going over to Dubai, claiming that they're making 50% returns in a week. That's sexy. If I speak and say, well, why did you laugh? If
On
I
anything.
on anything, nobody. But if I say to a client, we would hope to get you 5 to 10% returns,
Yeah,
let's say,
yeah.
well, that's not good enough. Matey boy is going to get me 50% in 2 weeks, and it's just, when I was young, there was no social media. It was the press, and the press was regulated. With social media, there's no regulation,
Mm,
and I think it's a real problem.
yeah. I just don't know how much of it is. You're right. The Instagram veneer, or filter through which the world looks rosy and has these potential offers is one thing. But I suspect that you're seeing some of that stuff because you're thinking about investments and pensions.
Yeah. Children are evolving as well, and my children, they're quite young, and they're not fools with social media. Then they know, probably because we tell them. I tell
Mm,
them all the time.
yeah.
But their friends aren't fools either. They know that a lot of this stuff is make believe.
But there's a whole sea of stuff out there that we don't understand, and a whole culture that we don't understand as well, I would guess.
Yeah.
The nature of people who can buy clothes on Klarna, or they're buying a coat with repayment plans that they can't
Yeah.
really afford,
Yeah.
let alone thinking about the nature of saving and investments and compound interest. What becomes normalized
Mm.
amongst their peer group is not normal to us. We don't have a clue necessarily about it.
And what I don't like is that they're the ones who have the finger pointed at them. It's almost victim shaming, isn't it? The naive youth. It's not their fault.
Mm.
If they're 18 and they're told they can buy some Reeboks and pay in 2 years' time, of course they're going to get the best pair of Reeboks that they can. It's whoever is facilitating that, the big business somewhere above. They're the ones who ought to be held accountable. It's not the kids' fault. They're dropping in the same traps that you or I would have done at that time
Yeah.
as well.
So without making it too depressing, because the nature of long-term planning for when you're very old
Yeah.
could be perceived to be depressing, how can we try and sum that up? How can we try and give some sound bites for people to think about? Does looking at credit scores become a useful benchmark? Does looking at an ISA with some money in it as a starting point matter? Does making extra contributions to your auto enrollment pension become the most sensible thing? Or is it, as I suspect you're about to say, kind of all of the above forms a suite of having sound financial savvy?
All of the above. Um, it is harder when you're starting out in life now because mortgage obviously costs you a lot of money. You've got to pay that off. You want to live in a nice house, but you ought to try and have some savings running alongside it. And a lot of my clients are fortunate in that they've got financial security. They didn't have financial security. They've built it with my help, or with their own actions over the years. They've got themselves into that place, and it's not a luxury, but it's a real comfort to them to have financial security in later life. And they all started somewhere, and that's one less thing they've got to worry about.
So one of the questions we're asking to lots of our guests, this being our 24th year in business,
Yeah.
and it's more pertinent to this topic, I think, than any other. What advice, I'm talking financial advice, generally speaking, for you, because we can go off topic very easily here. What advice would you give to your 24-year-old self based on what you know now?
Life advice will be just carry on as you are. You're doing great. No, I think I was a little bit rudderless really in my 20s, sort of early 20s and mid 20s. I was quite happy, but I didn't really know what I wanted. And that applied to my career, my finances. I think what I would have done, I should have bought a property earlier. I think Katie and we were probably in our late 20s when we bought our first property. In terms of investing, uh, I was always conscious of investing. And in the world I was in, you saw the results of investing. Even if it was, 100 quid a month on a regular basis, you saw that it worked. So just start doing everything sooner. But also, you're 24. You're going to make mistakes.
Well, it's all turned out all right in the end.
It has. Yeah.
Good. Thanks, Sam.
Thanks, Andy.